Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem Shai, Bashem Kakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Araquai. I'm back here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to read through a short passage in the book of Tobit, and I thought it was a very interesting passage because Tobit, within this period, he's basically making his supplication unto the Lord, right? And him, and eventually later on in the passage, you'll see what's her name, Sarah, the daughter-in-law. So eventually, she goes through her own affliction as well. So, if your sisters are also listening, it's very that's a very good chapter to read as well, because then you actually see the a righteous woman and the results thereof of actually striving for righteousness, as the scriptures say, seek righteousness and seek meekness, that you may be essentially hid from the Lord's wrath, right? Yes, she went through her moments of affliction, as well as Tobit here, but we see from both um, individuals here that the Lord remembered their prayers, and just like we want the Lord to remember, ultimately our prayers in these times, right? Um, so I'll read through it, because these stories are very, it's always good to pull different, accounts from these different stories, to have these things going through a mental Rolodex, in these times of trouble, right? Because we see all these different, we see essentially the wars and rumors of wars pursuant to Matthew, the 24th chapter. We see essentially the sword, the hammer of the earth, Trump being, um, placing a lot of hell upon our people because they don't understand that these things are coming from the Lord, because they're essentially being punished for their wickedness. As a matter of fact, before I read that, let me get this here in Amos. This is Amos chapter 3, verse 1, and it says, "Hear this, that the word of the Lord Yahweh hath spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought you up from the land of Egypt, saying, You only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for your iniquities." So all these different examples of the different ice ages, you see our people being deported, you see our people, you know, um, hemmed up. All these different things are essentially scourges for amendment, because our people don't understand that you sinned against your power, right? So, and the scriptures say that Judah and Israel be oppressed together, pursuant to Jeremiah 50, where in this revamped version of Babylon, the kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom, will essentially reunite, and essentially they'll be oppressed, right? They'll be oppressed in this modern day Babylon, right, which is known as America. Okay, so since I got that out, I wanted to just read a short passage here, and Lord's will is, as always, that this lesson may be edifying, right? So this is Tobit, chapter 3. This is verse 1 here, and it says, that it says here, then I being grieved did weep, and in my sorrow prayed, saying, O Lord, Yahweh Bashem Shai, thou art just in all thy works and all thy ways, and mercy and truth, and thou judgest truly and justly forever. Remember me and look upon me, and punish me not for my sins and ignorances, and the sins of my fathers who have sinned before thee. Right? So he understood that the condition, Tobit understood that the condition that they were in during this time, because they were essentially, Tobit as well, of the tribe of Naphtali, right? So they were essentially the different tribes, the northern tribes. They were taken into captivity under the Assyrians, right? Going back into, I think that's First Kings or I believe Second Kings the 17th, right? And so that was that shortly occurred right after the split of Solomon's kingdom. His kingdom was split. Solomon transgressed, right? So essentially, turmoil and havoc started becoming, started we started going into captivity, basically, right? A lot of the kings, especially of the northern kingdom, a lot of them were not righteous people, right? And only a few, like maybe three or four of the southern kingdom after the reign of Rehoboam were actually righteous, right? And then eventually they were taken into captivity under the Babylonians, right? So he understood that they were being punished because they transgressed against the Lord, right? So here it says, this is verse 4. As a matter of fact, hold on, I'll read verse 4 actually, and it says here, for they obeyed not thy commandments, therefore thou hast delivered us for a spoil and unto captivity and unto death, and for a proverb of reproach unto all nations whom we have dispersed, right? So there was essentially a dispersed of the tribes during this time, but we also know that's how we also know that we fit those curses pursuant to Deuteronomy the 28th chapter, which I'm going to get. Let me get this 1 second. I'll read verse 15, then I'll jump down. This is Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 15. And it says here, 1 second. This is, but it shall come to pass, and here the topic here is consequences for disobedience. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy power, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So this is one of the curses that I kind of wanted to echo that Tobit describes here, right? And we will be scattered. This is verse 64. And it says, and the Lord Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth, even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations you shall find no ease, right? So essentially you'd be in a state of captivity, right? You would be, what's it called? You'd be subject to payments. You would be, facing gruesome work, right? You wouldn't be able to enjoy your children. You'd be at adverse with your parents. You'd be experiencing all these different forms of curses, right? You wouldn't have stability within your family. There's no cohesion amongst you as a family, as a people. When you look at the other nations, you realize, like, man, there's always a sentiment of cohesion, right? They would be working together as a group, right? And they'll be prospering because they are not the Lord's people, right? All these different curses came upon us as a people for our disobedience, right? So that's also key points. That's how we also know that we are the people of the Lord, right? Finishing up in verse 65, and it says, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and feeling of eyes and sorrow of mind, right? So in this condition they would be in a sorrowful state, and that's what America has so strongly been for the mass majority of our people. Going back to different events such as the war on drugs, or the Trail of Tears, or the Buffalo Massacre, and so on and so forth. So many different events have taken place where our people, have been essentially a reproach and a proverb, right? They were named all these different, examples of different proverbs, and that's actually one of the curses too, actually, since Tobit actually mentioned that. 1 second. This is verse 37, and it says, and thou shalt become an astonishment and a byword and a proverb, and a proverb and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee, right? So I'm kind of just jumping back and forth here between Tobit's time and our time, but just to show that I'm just showing some parallels between basically his time, even though the only thing that's really different is the captivity. So he's in captivity under the Assyrians. We're in captivity under these modern day Assyrians, right? Under these Americans. And therefore, the principles are still the same. We're still subject to payments. We're still having these, we're still scattered, right? Right. Even though a lot of us are in America, we're still scattered, we're still reproached, we're still being called a proverb and a byword, right? And we're still afflicted, right? So, only a very small remnant would actually come back, unto the Lord, right? Um, okay, so I'm going to go back to verse 3, and it says here, and now thy judgments are many and true. Deal with me according to my sins of my fathers, because we have not kept thy commandments, neither have walked in truth before thee. Therefore, therefore deal with me as seemeth best unto thee, and command my spirit to be taken from me, that I may be dissolved from the earth. For it is profitable for me to die rather than to live, because I have heard of false reproaches, and have much sorrow, right? So basically he's in a sorrowful state, because Tobit, well, in the last chapter, he's experiencing a lot of reproach, for actually trying to do the right thing, right? So just like, and it's just the same parallels, like the scriptures say, there is nothing new under the sun. So as he was striving to actually be upright in captivity, he felt, I should say, reproach, from his own people, right? He was essentially being afflicted. So the affliction wasn't just the fact that he lost his blindness, but also from the fact that, he's trying to actually strive to be upright in a world that's against him, in a society that's, upholds a bunch of wickedness, right? So, let me get this here. Actually, I don't know if I have this written down. It's Isaiah. 1 second. This is Isaiah chapter 59, verse 15, and it says, "Yea, truth faileth, and he that departeth from evil maketh himself a prey." Excuse me. And the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no judgment. So there was essentially, what Tobit was going through, basically, you had moments where he was being afflicted. So I'm going to read this as an example and show you that, right? So this is, I want to jump back to the second chapter. I was showing what he was actually doing. Let's see here. Okay, this is Tobit chapter 2, verse, I'll start at verse 5. And the point's in 6. And it says, "Then I returned and washed myself and ate my meat in heaviness, remembering the prophecy of Amos, as he said, Your feast shall be turned into mourning, and all your mirth into lamentation. Therefore I wept, and after going down of the sun, I went and made a grave and buried him." So essentially, he was burying a lot of our people, right? So it says here, but my neighbors, I'm sorry, I'll continue on. It says, and I'll read verse 7 again, and it says, "Therefore I wept, and after the going down of the sun, I went and made a grave and buried him. But my neighbors mocked me. This man is yet not afraid to be put to death for this matter, who fled away. Yet alone I buried the dead again. And the same night I returned from the burial and slept by the wall of my courtyard, and being polluted, and my face was uncovered, Then I knew not that there were sparrows in the wall, and mine eyes being opened, the sparrows muted warm dung into mine eyes, and the whiteness came into mine eyes, and I went to the physicians, but they helped me not. Moreover, a Cacarus um, did nourish me until I went into Elemaeus, right? So, this is what he was basically doing. They were having a feast, right? And eventually, he couldn't even, because he was such in a heavy mindset, right? Because the scriptures, talk about how, in much wisdom, is much grief, when you strive to actually have an upright sort of attitude in a society where you're surrounded by wickedness. As it says in Peter's, Lot was vexed with a filthy conversation. When you go into that word in conversation in the etymology, it actually refers to a manner of life. And the manner of life is strongly contrary to the ways of the Lord actually wants us to be, right? So that's why we see the heavy judgment that are falling upon America and upon these upon Babylon, right? Because you see the way people live, and it's like you're constantly being tormented, especially our people, right? Because of their wicked behaviors, right? And the internet basically gives us like a snapshot of our people's wickedness, right? Kind of like how the prophet Ezekiel saw the abominations of our people, the things that they were doing. He was asked to look into the wall, and he saw them like weeping for Tammuz. He saw this is the internet gives us like a digital version of the same thing, right? So, um, essentially, the point is this is some of the things he was doing and striving to be upright, especially within a society that is against him, right? Just like the same thing with the prophets. They strive, I don't know, we're trying to be upright, have a living sacrifice, and in this society they kind of look down on you because, okay, you don't eat pork anymore, or you don't eat shellfish anymore, right? Because we're being conformed into the ways of the Lord as opposed to being conformed into the ways of this world, right? Because we understand that, pursuant to Romans, the wages of sin is death, right? And that's what lies in this society. It's just death and decay and destruction, right? All these different practices, customs, holidays, unholy days, it just leads towards death, right? So, um, okay, let me go back to his prayer. I'm going to continue in verse 6, and it says, command therefore that I may now be delivered from this distress and go into an everlasting place, and turn not thy face away from me, right? So, we want to be, delivered from this distress, because it's affliction. You're afflicted not just in your bodies, you're afflicted, being surrounded by people at work, you're afflicted, being in this environment, you can't actually enjoy anything. So it really explains and conveys, Tobit's heaviness, right? So we partake in that same share of, heaviness. I think I quoted this earlier. This is Ecclesiastes 1 verse 17, and it says, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly, and I perceived that this also is vexation of spirit. For much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increases the sorrow, right? So you find yourself more being alone. Even though Tobit actually had a wife, he had a son, I think they had a dog too, but even in all those things, you can still feel alone, because they don't understand the they don't understand the entire condition of the battle. They don't understand the grief. That's why, even though you might have a woman, or you might have children, or you might have, siblings, unless you actually congregate with godly men, then they're not going to fully understand your grief or your suffering. So most of the times you might actually find yourself alone, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but this is just part of the our condition as a whole, right? And we want the Lord to, protect us and deliver us out of this madness, right? Because this society is really just a failed experiment, right? And there needs to be new heavens and new earth, right, that dwells in righteousness, right? So, I read these last two, and it says here, and it came to pass that day that in Ecbatane, the city of Media, Sarah, the daughter-in-law of Raguel, was also reproached by her father's maids, because she had been married to 7 husbands, whom Admastius, the evil spirit, had killed. Therefore they had lain with her, does not know that thou hast strangled thine husbands, and thou hast already 7 husbands, neither thou was named after any of them. Right, so essentially she was being reproached, she was being ridiculed, because all these husbands, she they were supposed to be married to her, but she didn't. She was also just suffering from her own version of reproach as well. But the point I really wanted to hit, that the prayers, those prayers went up to the Lord, right? So I'm just gonna jump down to verse 16, and it says, so the prayers of them were both heard before the majesty of the great power Yahweh Bashem Shine. And Raphael was sent to heal them both, that is, to scale away the whiteness from Tobit's eyes, and to give Sarah, the daughter-in-law of Raguel, for a wife to Tobias, the son of Tobit, and to bind Admastius, the evil spirit that belonged to Tobias by right of inheritance. The self same time came Tobit home and entered into the house, and Sarah, the daughter-in-law of Raguel, came down from the upper chamber, right? So essentially their prayers were basically gone up to the Lord, right? So an angel came and was able to recompense them, for their essentially their good deeds, right? So these are actually good stories to go into, right? Because we want the Lord to remember us also, for our good deeds. Lord's will, the Lord has mercy upon us, right? So this is Psalms 125, verse 4, and it says, do good, O Lord, unto those that be good, and unto them that are upright in their hearts, right? So our people, when you read about how Jacob was described, as Jacob was a plain man dwelling in tents, one of the definitions for that Hebrew word is upright, because that's the way we were created to be, but only a very few, a very small remnant would actually strive to actually be upright, as opposed to the rest of our people, where it says in Ezra they have loathed thy law, and loathe basically describes a strong dislike for something. So continuing on, and it says, as for such, verse 5, as for such turn aside unto their crooked ways, the Lord shall lead them forth with the workers of iniquity, but peace shall be unto Israel, right? So, we want the Lord to remember us, also remember our prayers. You might have opportunities where you might have to pray for a brother, right? Those situations come up, and we want the Lord to basically remember us and remember our household, right? So, I just thought it was a good thing just to discuss this. As a matter of fact, I'll end off with this one. Let me get this here. Because this is kind of segue into the point of praying. This is Revelation chapter 8, verse 3, and it says, and another angel came and stood before the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given to him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne, right? So when you go into the Levitical priesthood, one of the key things that was used as a sacred object was the golden censer. So basically what happens is you put the incense inside, right? And the incense is supposed to be it was one of the sacred objects that was used So for example, when Aaron would go into the Holy of Holies, they basically, they would use the incense, to in the incense would be put in the golden censer, right? So basically, our prayers, that which is then is now, right? So our prayers are also likened unto that incense, right? As a matter of fact, which basically is the prayers of the elect are going up to the Lord, because our prayers are also likened unto an incense. This is Psalms 141 verse 2, and it says, let my prayer be set before thee as incense, and lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice, right? So a lot of the priestly duties, are essentially, because we are the sacrifice in these times, right? So our prayers, when we pray, it's likened unto an incense, right? So, that's why I just wanted to, read that, since we're in the topic of praying and so on and so forth, right? And that's another thing I also want to mention as well. With all these different calamities, don't pray before you leave your house, right? Pray before you leave your house, right? Because we're in the valley of the shadow of death, as King David said, man. So anyways, I just thought I would just, read that story real quick. The rest of the chapter, for sisters who are listening, is very good to read the rest of that chapter, right? I just wanted to touch on it like real quick, but anyways, hopefully this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai. Until next time, I say shalom.